Gentlemen, super nice to have you here with us today. Maybe just a quick introduction as to who I am. I'm David. I work for Squake as the head of carbon solutions and procurement. And the purpose of today, of course, is to come together and to discuss a little bit more openly whether companies should react now when it comes to buying carbon credits. But before we dive into that, it would be really nice to hear from the two of you who you are. So Robin, over to you.
Thank you. Yeah, I'm Robin. We've known each other now, maybe since a year. I've only joined the carbon removal industry 1.5 years ago. My background is more in the, let's call it, tech and internet industry. I've worked at LinkedIn, The Trade Desk, which is one of Google's biggest competitors, and for quite a long time at Statista in Hamburg. But have chosen to try something completely new, and that brought me to the carbon removal industry, and I've been with Carbonfuture since 1.5 years as their business development lead for EMEA, working with clients, or hopefully soon to be clients, so companies on the buy side in this industry.
Amazing.
I think that's over to me. I'm Emil, also from Squake's Carbon Solutions and Procurement team, mainly focusing nowadays on sourcing climate projects for our customer base, vetting them correctly, etc., but also observing and monitoring any political developments in the market. As I have a background in political science, also worked in public sector consulting before joining Squake around 2 years ago. So that makes me the perfect fit to also monitor all of these developments. As David mentioned before, we work in the same department to procure credits for our customers.
Awesome, thank you. Yeah, and maybe to set the stage a little bit, and for your knowledge there, Robin, we set out to interview a few carbon partners, what we call almost like our suppliers on the supply side, to understand what is really the main challenges that they experience. And about a year ago, where we interviewed about 50 of them, asking different questions from, is it the tech solutions that they require? Is it to do with financing? And what eventually came out very strong among all of them is to say that there isn't enough sales from their side. They need more clients purchasing. And we were thinking, what is the reason why they feel that the clients aren't purchasing? They had their own hypotheses to say, they're not aware of the projects, etc., etc. We then set out to speak to these potential buyers of carbon credits to understand what is the limitations, at least on their side, when it comes to buying. And something that came out quite clearly there was around, there's a lack of transparency in the market on the one side. The other side, they also had lack of guidance, so not knowing what to do and when to do it. And I think that's also why we want to have this discussion today. So really feel free to share your thoughts on it. If you have a difference in opinion, that's amazing. But to actually ask the question, when should companies react? In other words, when should they buy? And I would assume that the answer is now, but I would love to hear from the two of you on your perspective. When is the best times for corporate organizations out there to buy carbon credits?
I'll come to that question in a second, but there's one thing you mentioned that I found very relevant as well, and it kind of leads nicely back to maybe why I'm here. You talked about lack of transparency. So Carbonfuture was actually founded with the idea to bring that trust infrastructure into what used to be a market that was not very transparent. The idea was with the founding of our company that for the first time in durable carbon removal credits purchasing, you would actually see now the full chain of proof or the full chain of custody from where carbon is taken out of the atmosphere all the way to where the carbon sink is. And therefore, for a supplier and a buyer, make this chain really visible and understandable. And that's just something I wanted to mention at the beginning. Why should companies purchase now? I mean, probably a topic we could spend 10 minutes on, but I'll try to be brief here. I think much of it comes back to the question of reaching net zero, and what does reaching net zero actually mean? I mean, many organizations out there, they have net zero targets, be it 2030, 2040, 2050. And the assumption is that they won't be able to reduce their emissions to zero themselves, but they will have remaining emissions that they then need to compensate for elsewhere. And the idea with durable carbon removals is that they invest into very high quality projects and therefore procure credits from such projects and technologies. Now, why to do this now rather than in 10 years? This market is very nascent. There hasn't been much development on durable carbon removal solutions yet. And you have to think about it in the way that everything that happens now will benefit a lot of organizations and all of us in the long run. So why companies should start doing so now? You can think about when you purchase credits now, maybe it's the first time you've done that, you kind of get a feeling for how does it actually work, how do I get a credit, who do I work with, how do I retire it, and so forth, get kind of acquainted with that market. There are other strategies out there where companies think of doing so. They purposely invest in long-term contracts so that they can lock in prices that are valid now, because at the moment no one really exactly knows whether the prices will go up or down. And then also securing your supply. If you have a strategy in place that where you know you will do so for many, many years, it does make sense to secure supply in a market that maybe has a bit of an undersupply at the moment because the demand hasn't developed properly yet.
I think I can agree with all of the above. I think one notion that hasn't been mentioned yet is obviously also SBTi. And I think especially with regards to SBTi, corporates and organizations are always a bit more looking at how can we improve our operations, how can we reduce our CO2 footprint, and that obviously must have a priority, because it's better not to emit any CO2 emissions than to produce them and then remove them later on. However, that picture is incomplete, because obviously the IPCC reports include a requirement of 10 gigatons of CO2 removal by 2050 in order to reach the climate targets. So this is probably the less known fact of the IPCC reports and of the climate targets and how to reach them. And essentially, if we want to reach these 10 gigatons by 2050, we need to start now. And I think what we were able to see in the past couple of years is that we already moved from probably something like pilot-phased facilities that could produce a couple thousand tons, be it biochar, enhanced rock weathering, or direct air capture, for instance, to facilities that are now being built that can capture hundreds of thousands of tons, if not even millions of tons of CO2 from the earth, from the atmosphere. So I think we are on a path, but we need to keep up this momentum, and therefore we need more corporates to basically engage also in carbon removal now.
Yeah.
So two things, actually three things are here and here. The one, of course, is we're talking about the environment, and the more we have a negative impact on the environment, the more important it is for us to react quickly. But then you mentioned a little bit around the market forces. I heard about supply and demand and the potential that you need to lock in your price now, or even make sure that you can ensure your supply before the demand increases. And I want to get back to that now, but you commented on a couple of things around SBTi. Regulatory frameworks that are in place. We hear a lot about the 2030 targets or 2050. Are there very clear sort of requirements for organizations to meet, in that if they don't meet it by that time, it's going to be more difficult for them to, of course, ensure that there's no penalties and so forth? Is that a main driver at this stage for organizations, therefore, to say, I need to do it now because by 2030 I will have a problem if I haven't?
I think or at least from my perspective, the very honest opinion is that there is probably not as much clarity on that regard from organizations such as SBTi. So I think the entire market was hoping for a bigger release of SBTi this summer. It didn't come, it got a bit postponed. And obviously that raises a lot of questions of like, hey, how can I use these credits within my SBTi reporting? Or is it just kind of some sort of donation that I do? And obviously this is time that we don't have. So I think more clarity would be helpful. But also when it comes to other regulatory initiatives that could foster demand for these credits, I think that would also be very helpful. We see now a bit more commitments from governments to also procure for themselves, or they have some sort of prices that they hand out to the best projects. But I think we are still lacking very clear market mechanism that would also force companies to purchase these credits, or that would not force them, but would include it in the broader mechanisms.
And it's SBTi. Let's not make this whole conversation or panel about SBTi, but it is really like, I speak to buyers, I speak to corporates every single day. And the amount of times that these four letters are mentioned is very, very high. So I have a feeling that SBTi as a guidance, as an organization, is super important for the companies out there. But similar to what you both said, the in clarity is given as well. I get asked these questions, oh, but how does that topic relate to SBTi, et cetera, et cetera. I think the overall issue for companies at the moment is, in the past, correct me if I'm wrong, but the guidance from SBTi was always reduce, reduce, reduce until you can't reduce no more, and then start thinking about removals. Well, if we did that, if we continued that sort of for a very, very long time, we will get to a point where the net zero targets are coming soon. And if we only start purchasing removals soon, or a couple of years before net zero targets, that won't work because there won't be enough supply because we haven't done anything for years. There is currently some developments that these things could look a bit better and that this can happen in parallel. But I'm absolutely with you that in a way, the communication also, maybe moving away from blog posts that are 7 pages long to clear communications, maybe an infographic, maybe something that the CSOs of this world, the head of sustainability, understand quickly.
You really need to invest a couple of hours in order to understand what the latest update meant. And that's exactly. Not even including like, okay, what does this entire SBTi initiative in total even mean, and how can I position myself within it? I think it's just way too complex.
Did you have understanding for these organizations? Because the ones eventually in charge of the decision making around, are you going to spend X amount of money to purchase credits, don't necessarily have that technical understanding or scientific view on this, right? So, and therefore they end up doing nothing. Which brings me back to the point that we're also still talking about the voluntary carbon market, right? So in some ways we're saying everything here is voluntary. But what do we see in that regard? Do we feel that it's going to become much more mandatory at some point, and that, it will not be an option for these companies anymore because it's not a charity sort of component?
I mean, personally, I hope so. And I do observe that there is a lot of conversations happening on European level where, new regulations are currently being formed for a couple of years further down the line. I do think at some point the voluntary carbon market will become a mandatory one. That's my hypothesis. And obviously, it would absolutely help the industry to develop faster. Sure.
Also, I think one important side note to this is that the basically permanent carbon removal market is, from a pricing perspective, much closer to what we have in the EU ETS market, for instance, that we see prices for an allowance of 70 to 80 euros currently, and it's expected to increase further to, I think, 150 or so, if I'm not mistaken, in 2030. And I think that's a price that is relatively close, but still below the average carbon removal credit that is sold. And that's the vast difference compared to something like a avoidance credit from a avoided deforestation project or so, that were able to be used a while back in an earlier phase of the EU ETS, which led to the fact that the price of the EU ETS decreased, and that was perceived as not helpful. I don't see that this dynamic would happen with carbon removal credits, because they're just priced differently and in a different category. So I think it would be helpful, and companies could, for instance, and that's just an idea that I've seen in the market, for instance, I think also from your expert, Sebastian Mahnhardt, to make it voluntary for a company to either have EU ETS allowances or carbon removal credits, because currently they would still pay an upmark to have a carbon removal credit instead of an EU ETS allowance, but it wouldn't destroy the market.
I mean, I hear a lot about carbon removal, right? And we see in the market that if you talk biochar, it's already in the 150s up to 200 euros per ton. We talk about direct air capture, which is in the very high, 800, 900s. And I can understand that the Microsofts of the world are able to step more into the removal space, but how do you endorse that a smaller organization, transition in the direction of removal? Why would I buy a removal if I can go equivalent avoidance credit that's also equivalent to 1 ton of carbon dioxide removed from the atmosphere, but it's going to cost me 7 euros per ton?
Well, that's the golden question in a way, and that is, a question we hear on the buy side, of course, a lot. And greetings to all the CFOs out there, because that's what they care about, of course, understandably. I mean, if you've done something for the planet, so to say, in the past, and you purchase the credits from the avoidance world, which is what you just touched upon, typically like avoided deforestation or a nature-based solutions credit, afforestation. Those credits are ranging avoidance somewhere between $5 to $7 or so, I don't know, and nature-based solutions somewhere around 30. Now we come with durable carbon removal credits, which are 5x of the nature-based solutions one, something between 130 to 200 euros per credit. And that's for the cheapest technology out there, which is biochar carbon removal. Yeah, how do you package that into convincing a buyer? That's very, very tricky. And it all comes back a little bit to that voluntary action. And also, I think a lot of my job is educational. Yeah. Like making sure that people on the other side, so to say, understand what a durable carbon removal actually does, or the technology behind it, which is taking carbon out of the atmosphere and putting it away eternally. And I think that educational level, or for every sustainability manager in the world, does not understand that yet, because the market of the durable removals is so young. Yeah. So really the process starts with investing a lot in educational content as well as educational meetings, and then moving step by step.
So in light of companies having to react now, do we feel at some point only removal credits will be eligible? In other words, companies won't have the opportunity anymore to purchase credits outside of removals?
I think my 2 cents to it is, or are, that due to the reasons mentioned before, EU ETS prices are way above avoidance credit prices, so it wouldn't make sense to have avoidance credits inside one of these mandatory schemes, but I don't see them disappearing anytime soon from voluntary action. I think it's still a valuable contribution towards the Earth, essentially, but I think it's just going to play a different role when it comes to mandatory markets.
I mean, it's also clear that, you know, without durable carbon removal, there is no net zero. That's a fact. Therefore, the market will stay alive. How quick it will grow, tricky to say. Depends a lot on policy as well and voluntary action. But, you know, there's maybe one sort of client case I'd like to share. There's one buyer out there in the durable removal market who I think does it the perfect way. They have a current portfolio of emissions that they are compensating for, and that consists roughly of, let's say, 15% durable removals and 85% nature-based solutions. But they have also a clear path to their 2050 goals, which is turning that small piece into a bigger piece. So they want to step-by-step ramp up so that in 2050, let's say that what they still need to compensate for is 90% durable removals and 10% nature-based. And the hope is that when they do so and all the other companies join, that the prices then for durable removals will also fall. And also what we often or sometimes don't think about, and again, I'm not a 100% expert on these topics, but I understand the argument of if we only invested in afforestation, reforestation and so forth, we don't have the land for that. So you also have that land situation that it competes with land for food production. So we can't just go on forever doing nature-based solutions. So that example of, like, you know, changing your portfolio from, let's say, 10-15% durable removals and then step by step increasing it to a much, much bigger part of it is a very, very good way forward.
I want to get a little bit to some topics that I've mentioned around supply and demand, like these market forces. And I'm wondering, you know, to what extent we see more and more innovation coming up in this industry. We see that direct air capture and biochar companies are, you know, expanding their operations. They're getting better facilities. Do we foresee, therefore, that the price it's going to cost them to produce these type of credits in the future is going to come down, and therefore it's better for companies to actually wait and pay for a lower price at a later stage? But then at the same time, that is balanced out with the demand increasing, right? Because we get closer to these 2030 targets. We know that at some point companies are going to have to react. What is your view on this balance between the supply getting better and is it going to reduce prices versus the demand increasing as we get closer to sort of targets?
I think what I always mention in that regard is more anecdotally, essentially 2 years ago when I first joined this market, and especially the carbon removal market, there weren't just not that many producers that could actually already deliver carbon removal credits. And the volumes, if a company was able to produce something like 10,000 tons, that was already perceived as a very big company in the market. 2 years down the line, we speak to companies that want to or have the ambition to scale to hundreds of thousands to millions of tons of carbon removal per year. So I was always thinking, okay, at some point we will have an oversupply because there are just that many buyers currently, but the amount of buyers is increasing and also the volume these buyers are purchasing is increasing drastically, and therefore, so far I haven't seen a curve there that would show an oversupply or so. So the price is relatively stable. You see sometimes a bit an up curve when a big purchase has been made or so. But yeah, interested to hear your perspective on it.
I think my belief is that in the long to medium term, I do believe that if we take biochar for an example, it is not unlikely for the purchasing prices of credits, for them to go actually up again. And the reason is that I think there are many 2030 net zero targets for several organizations out there. So, I can imagine that towards 27, 28 or so, there's a lot of companies coming around the corner saying, well, I'm ready now, let's go, let's do this and let's purchase. But will the supply have developed equally quickly in the meantime? I'm not 100% sure. Obviously, from a macroeconomical point of view, the more buyers come in steadily, the more we have the chances for those technologies to reduce costs and therefore maybe also reduce the prices. But in the short term, I actually see what I said previously as a more realistic scenario, that with these coming short-term targets, we will see a spike, which also brings me back then to the previous argument of securing prices. If you know that you want to be part of the durable carbon removal purchasing market for longer than a year, so for longer than a spot purchase, it is a valid thought to think about investing into multi-year contracts in order to lock in the prices that are offered to you now, that you're still paying them in 28 or 29.
And to extend this also, it's not only about locking in the prices, but also locking in the delivery of the credits, because
the supply.
For instance, if you start looking for something in Germany now for the next year, you will probably have a relatively difficult time finding something, because just a lot of organizations already procured their volumes for 2025. So if you want to have something for 2026, you need to start relatively early.
Would you say this is the strategy that big organizations like Microsoft, the Frontier Group, all these sort of consortiums pulling together the BCGs and stuff, do you think that's for them the idea here, to lock in the prices, to secure that price, despite having the purchasing power? I get that in their big emitters. But are they sort of showing us the model example here of taking long-term agreements, maybe for the next 10 to 20 years, and getting those prices locked in?
Yes, but also I think more importantly, I think they want to be the enabler of this market as well. I think they've taken a stance and positions to say, like, we acknowledge how important durable carbon removal is in the long run. They understand that in 2050 onwards, we need to remove 10 gigatons are 10 billion tons per year permanently, which is an incredible number. And obviously, I think even us in the removals space, we do, of course, also say the reduction of emissions is the absolute base of everything. We must do that continually. But to come back to your point, yes, that's part of their intention. But if we look at a big player like Microsoft, I think it's part of their strategy also that they say, well, we want to put our history onto net zero. So kind of clean up the
sort
past.
Of retrospectively go back.
And I mean, that is, if I can say so, Champions League behavior. But can I now expect from every organization to do the same or act the same? It's probably tricky because admittedly, maybe not everyone has the same margin to be able to afford these kind of activities.
And that actually leads me now to think of more like small and medium-sized type of organizations. What would be your encouragement to these type of organizations? Because they could look at these conglomerates and say, oh, well, they have the purchasing power, they are huge, they can afford buying direct air capture. What would your encouragement be to these organizations to actually get going, to get started?
If I could chip in one more thought on that, I think what our industry also, what we maybe need to learn a little bit more is, this is about stories as well. This is about impact. And I want to personally move away from, the term or selling credits or doing compensation to what do the projects behind the credits actually do in terms of co-benefits, in terms of social impact around, because there's a lot of good stuff, there's jobs that are being created. We had a beautiful moment this year where one of my colleagues visited a biochar carbon removal project in Kenya, and the biochar carbon removal there is done by farmers. And one of the farmers said to her, oh, by the way, on her arm, this is a biochar baby. And she asked, what do you mean a biochar baby? And she explained, well, with the revenues that I made through biochar carbon removal as part of this supply chain, I was able for the first time to give birth in a hospital.
Amazing.
And that's what I mean, like maybe we need to move a little bit away from like the hard facts, sometimes also the impact stories behind it. That gives also the buyers the opportunity to get something tangible and not just buy a credit.
Yeah, I think in addition to that, knowledge and education is probably a very big lever in that regard, because I think most of these small and medium-sized companies don't even have the capacity or the staff to look into all of these different things, define their own due diligence process as Microsoft did, and just vet projects like a huge organization could, and therefore they have to work with intermediaries first, I think, in order to not overpay for something. Secondly, knowledge is necessary and education is necessary from organizations like Squake, like Carbonfuture, in order to really get the message through to them. And then I really also see a bit the ball in the court of SBTi to also get a bit of clarity towards the guidance that they provide and hand out, because most of these small and medium-sized companies haven't heard of biochar, but they have heard of SBTi. And if they understand, okay, I can use biochar credits or the impact that these biochar credits generate on the ground towards my SBTi reporting, I think that's a very good lever. And obviously, if there's even a mandatory market mechanism, that would obviously also help very much.
And one vehicle that could also be an option is, I think the term offsetting in compensation is out there and everyone kind of grasps the idea behind it. But there's something else called the contribution approach, and especially for small, medium-sized enterprises, there is the option to just think, okay, we want to do something proactively for the planet. I mean, we don't need to discuss in what shape the planet is or where we're heading to, but then to set a budget aside and say, okay, with this amount of money, I'm willing to make an investment into the world or into the planet and help the climate. That is a way in order to get things going. And then it's not this sort of ton for ton approach where you're looking at the exact emissions that you're putting out there and getting them back at the cheapest price possible. But with a contribution approach, you can look at your budget and then get convinced of opportunities that are out there and simply invest in them.
And, it makes me think just of this analogy where, it's called the starfish analogy, where there's a whole beach with starfish sort of splashed out onto the beach, and someone is picking up the starfish and throwing it into the water and doing the next. And someone else that was observing that says, how do you think you're making any impact? There's millions out here. And then the person says, well, that makes an impact to this one, right? And what I really like is that there's so many tech solutions out there, the likes of Square, Carbonfuture, that now allows clients to go and purchase even the smallest amount, right? You don't have to put in this ridiculous big lump of sum of money in order to get involved in the game. You can really, really start small. And I think that's a nice sort of analogy to encourage organizations out there to say you don't have to feel like the barriers here, but the technology really does allow you to come in at the lowest level, right?
And I think what we also shouldn't forget, and that is something where I can totally put myself into the shoes of many organizations out there, there is a certain past with the offsetting industry, and there were things that didn't go down too well. But I think it's also the job in our industry to educate them what has happened in between. There is platforms that provide a trust infrastructure, that provide a tracking. You have a totally different visibility into what's happening behind the credit than 5 or 6 years ago. And I think that's also an educational piece.
Also the type of project is much easier to handle in that regard, because it's an engineered solution.
Yes.
So you have machine data that you can read out, that you can use, for instance, for tracking of the entire supply chain, etc., and the production parameters, for instance, to ensure that the biochar, for instance, is of high quality. And I think these pieces of information just have to get communicated even more towards companies, so that we have more participants in the market.
So as a final thought, in sort of summary, what would be your sort of one tagline as to why companies should act now? To both of you.
Do you want to start so I can buy myself some more time?
Yeah, I think my tagline would be just to call into their ideology and also logical thinking. Because we have mentioned now a couple of times, for 2050 we need 10 gigatons. And all of these companies, all of the CFOs of the small, medium-sized companies, but also of the big corporates, understand how a growth model works. And they understand, okay, if we want to have 10 gigatons per year of removal in 2050, where do we need to start and how does it have to grow? And what's my role within it? So I would just appellate.
Yeah.
So with you saying in order to reach that 10 gigaton, the time is now. We need to start now. Everyone needs to contribute, even whatever small size they can, in order for us to get there.
All different types of use cases you can find. If a contribution claim, for instance, works for you, that you really can say, okay, maybe it doesn't make sense for my organization to compensate every ton of CO2 emission, which might be millions of tons of CO2 emissions, with just biochar, because it will just be way too expensive. Potentially it's an option to just have a budget of a couple of 100,000, a couple of million or so, that they can start investing in that they can start getting a feeling for the different projects and also how the market works.
Yeah. I think the getting a feeling for the projects and technologies, that is super important as well. I was really thinking about my tagline now, and I think my tagline is going in the direction of like better done than perfect.
Yeah.
If you're an organization that has a net zero target, go out there and give it a try. Like buy your first carbon removal credit, ideally more, and get a feeling for what are the projects that are behind it? How does procuring those credits work? How does retiring work? You will need it at some point. There's no doubt about that. And to put it in an analogy, if you're interested in skateboarding, you're probably just going to give it a try one day and see if it's for you or not. And maybe apply a similar thinking to the carbon removal market.
Gentlemen, thank you so much for both of you and your time and like your opinion around the topic. And yeah, we will do something like this again.
Cool.
Perfect. Thank you.